The day is the 23rd of June. The English and the Scottish armies form up for the last decisive battle of the War of Scottish Independence. The battle that would mark a turning point in the Scottish struggle for independence is about to begin. The Wars of Scottish Independence between England and Scotland began in 1296. The English, under the command of King Edward I, were initially successful, winning a decisive victory at the Battle of Falkirk, and by 1304 Scotland had been conquered. However, in 1306, Robert the Bruce seized the Scottish throne and the war was reopened. A year later, King Edward I died, and his son Edward II was crowned as king. Being young and inexperienced, he was incapable of providing the determined leadership his father had shown, and the English position soon became more difficult. In 1313, Robert the Bruce began to take action. He demanded the allegiance of all those who were still loyal to the old Scottish king under threat of losing their lands. He also demanded the surrender of the English garrison at Stirling Castle, one of the most important castles held by the English, as it controlled the route north into the Scottish Highlands. A year later, Edward Bruce, who was Robert's younger brother, besieged the castle. The English could not ignore this challenge and prepared a substantial campaign. An army of some 20,000 men was gathered, comprised of knights, longbowmen, men-at-arms, and some 2,000 heavily armed cavalry. This English army that headed north into Scotland was by far the largest ever to invade Scotland. The Scottish army numbered around 7,000 men. This included no more than 500 mounted troops. Unlike the English, the Scottish cavalry was not equipped for charging enemy lines and was suitable only for skirmishing and reconnaissance. The Scottish infantry was armed with axes, swords and pikes, and included only a few bowmen. On the morning of the 23rd of June 1314, it was still not certain if a battle would take place. The armies were still 8 miles apart, giving the now armoured Robert the Bruce enough time to decide whether to move northwards or westwards up the river into a district of hills. Robert knew that going to the hills would influence the plans of Edward II and his lords, as they had to pass this area in order to reach Stirling Castle. In an effort to rescue Stirling, Edward II continued to hurry his troops. They marched 70 miles in 1 week, resulting in his men being extremely worn out with fatigue and hunger. After finding out the Scots were on the move, the English march paused, and Edward II and his advisors began to make plans for the upcoming battle. Edward and his advisors knew the places where the Scots were likely to challenge them and sent orders for their troops to prepare. On the Scottish side, King Robert picked a flat field flanked by woodland known as New Park to set up camp for the upcoming battle. The woodland gave Robert and his foot soldiers an advantage, since the English were very adept at cavalry attacks. The Scots assembled defensive formations known as schiltrons, which were strong defensive squares of men with pikes. Thomas Randolph, 1st Earl of Moray, commanded the Scottish vanguard, and King Robert commanded the rearguard. His brother Edward led the 3rd Division, and Sir James Douglas commanded the 4th. In reserve, Sir Robert Keith commanded 500 horsemen. Soon after the Scottish formed up, 2 English cavalry formations advanced ahead of the main army. The first was commanded by the Earl of Gloucester and the Earl of Hereford. They followed behind a smaller detachment of roughly 300 soldiers. The advancing detachments marched toward the woodlands that hid the Scots and stood in the way of their route to Stirling. Little did the English know that Bruce had ventured ahead away from the rest of his army and away from the protection of the woods. The Earl of Hereford's nephew, Henry de Bohun, spotted King Robert away from the main bulk of his army and took advantage of this situation. Henry de Bohun charged forward in full combat gear. Seeing this, Bruce charged ahead of his men to face de Bohun in single combat. Bohun was killed by Robert, and the rest of Robert's guard rushed the English forces under Gloucester's and Hereford's command, who retreated. The smaller English detachment under the command of Robert Clifford and Henry de Beaumont was still advancing, not knowing what was happening. King Robert's nephew, who was the leader of the Scottish advanced guard, hearing that his uncle had repulsed the advanced guard of the English on the other side of the wood, thought that he must have his share. With his division, he marched across the open ground to meet the English detachment. They engaged the English and fierce combat opened out. The English cavalry struggled against the Scottish pikes, and the detachment was utterly routed. Some of the English fled to the castle, others to the king's army. During the night, the English forces crossed the stream known as the Bannockburn, establishing their position on the plain beyond it. A Scottish knight, Alexander Seton, who was fighting in the service of the English, deserted the English camp. He rode over to the Scottish and told Bruce that English morale was low, encouraging him to attack. In the morning, the Scots advanced towards the English. Edward was surprised to see the Scottish pikemen emerge from the cover of the woods and advance towards his position. As Bruce's army drew nearer, they paused and knelt in prayer. Edward said in surprise, "They pray for mercy." "For mercy, yes," one of his attendants replied, "but from God, not you. These men will conquer or die." The Earl of Gloucester had argued with the Earl of Hereford over who should lead the vanguard into battle. He had also tried to persuade the king that the battle should be postponed. This led the king to accuse him of cowardice. Goaded by the accusation, Gloucester advanced to meet the Scots. Few accompanied Gloucester, and soon after he reached the Scottish lines, he was quickly surrounded and killed. After quickly defeating this small English force, the Scottish continued to advance on the main English army. The Scottish pikes were proving to be effective, keeping the English knights at bay. The English then attempted to deploy their English and Welsh longbowmen to flank the advancing Scots. Seeing this, 500 Scottish cavalry under the Mareschal Sir Robert Keith attacked the English archers. The English archers were decimated. The English king looked over the battlefield with concern. The Scottish were fighting far more fiercely than he had thought. It soon became clear to Aymer de Valence and Giles d'Argenton, who was supposedly the third best knight in Europe, that the English had lost the battle and Edward II needed at all costs to be safely led. Seizing the reins of the king's horse, they dragged him away, closely followed by 500 knights of the royal bodyguard. Seeing the king retreating from the battlefield, the English army broke. Once the king and his guard were clear of the battle, d'Argenton turned to the king and said, "Sire, your protection was committed to me. But since you are safely on your way, I will bid you farewell, for never yet have I fled from a battle, nor will I now." He turned his horse to charge back into the ranks of Scottish, where he was overborne and slain. "10,000 English soldiers were killed in the battle and during the retreat. The number of Scottish casualties was far lower, perhaps 2,000 at most. After the battle, only one sizable group of men, all foot soldiers, made their escape to England. These were a force of Welsh spearmen who were kept together by their commander, Sir Maurice de Berkeley. Pursued by James Douglas and a small troop of horsemen, King Edward fled to Dunbar Castle, where he took a ship to Berwick. Stirling Castle, one of Scotland's most important fortresses, was surrendered to King Robert. Bothwell Castle, where a sizable party of English nobles, including the Earl of Hereford, had taken refuge, was also surrendered. The defeat secured Scottish independence, with England formally recognising Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland.